Jacob Ellis was known in Maplewood as the quiet, troubled son of the ever-patient Margaret Ellis. But when officers arrived for a simple welfare check, they uncovered a horrifying scene that shattered the illusion of a peaceful home and revealed a tragedy no one saw coming. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Maplewood's quiet streets as Officer Turner pulled up to the modest home on Pine Avenue. The call had come in just an hour earlier. Margaret Ellis, a 72-year-old retired schoolteacher, hadn't been seen for several days. Her neighbor, who often helped her with groceries, grew concerned when Margaret didn't answer the door or return phone calls. She hadn't picked up her medication from the pharmacy or attended her regular church meeting, something she never missed. It wasn't uncommon for older residents to go off the radar for a day or two, but Margaret's silence felt different, unnerving. Officer Turner knocked twice, then called out her name. No answer. He tried the handle and found the front door slightly ajar. The house was eerily silent inside. The familiar scent of lavender air freshener had faded, replaced with the overwhelming stench of alcohol and something harder to place, something metallic and thick in the air. Turner moved carefully through the dim hallway, radioing in that he was inside and requesting backup. Picture frames lined the walls, showing happier times. Margaret smiling with her late husband, holding a baby Jacob in her arms, a proud family at Christmas. But those smiles felt ghostly now, echoing a warmth that no longer lived in the house. As Turner stepped into the living room, he froze. Margaret lay motionless on the floor, her body surrounded by a scattering of broken items, a lamp, an overturned coffee table, shattered glass. Her arms were at strange angles, bruising already darkening across her pale skin. One look told him she was gone. Slumped on the couch just a few feet away sat Jacob Ellis, 29, reeking of booze, eyes glassy and unfocused. His shirt was stained with blood. He was mumbling softly, barely aware of the presence of the officer in the room. Paramedics arrived minutes later, but it was already too late. Margaret was pronounced dead at the scene. Jacob, still unable to stand on his own, was taken into custody. He didn't resist. He didn't ask questions. He didn't seem to understand what had happened. As neighbors gathered outside, watching with quiet dread as the scene unfolded, no one could make sense of what they were seeing. Margaret had always been generous, calm, and deeply patient with her troubled son. Jacob, though clearly struggling, had never shown violence in public. News spread fast in Maplewood. That same evening, social media filled with messages of shock and grief. No one expected the welfare check to uncover a crime scene, especially not one involving someone as well-loved as Margaret. The tragedy sent waves through the community, and speculation ran wild. What had driven Jacob to such violence? Was it a moment of uncontrolled rage or something more calculated? As police sealed off the home and began the forensic process, one thing was certain. This quiet neighborhood would never look the same again. What lay beneath the surface of the Ellis household was about to be uncovered, and the truth was far more disturbing than anyone had imagined. The investigation into Margaret Ellis's death began immediately, with officers securing the property and forensic teams combing through every room for evidence. Nothing appeared stolen, and there were no signs of forced entry, suggesting that Margaret had willingly let her attacker in. But the obvious suspect was already in custody, her own son. Jacob Ellis, disoriented and reeking of alcohol, had offered no explanation, barely stringing together coherent words during initial questioning. He had been placed under observation at the local jail, awaiting a medical evaluation and formal charges. But the deeper the detectives dug into Jacob's life, the more troubling the picture became. Jacob had been living with his mother for the past 8 months after losing his job at a hardware store. What started as a temporary arrangement quickly became permanent. Without steady income, Jacob spiraled into dependency, financially on his mother and emotionally on alcohol. Records showed that Margaret had reached out to local rehabilitation centers on Jacob's behalf at least twice in the last year. Notes found in her room included appointment reminders, AA pamphlets, and handwritten prayers, many of them referencing Jacob's name. It was clear she was desperately trying to help her son, even as his behavior grew more unpredictable. Neighbors began to come forward with troubling accounts. One woman who lived next door said she often heard yelling late into the night, shouting, crashing sounds, and even crying. Others reported seeing Jacob wandering the street barefoot, talking to himself, clearly intoxicated. Still, no one had called the authorities. Margaret had always reassured everyone that she had things under control, and in a town like Maplewood, people trusted their neighbors to handle family matters privately. The autopsy results confirmed what investigators feared. Margaret had died from blunt force trauma to the head. Multiple blows, likely inflicted with a household object, had fractured her skull. Defensive wounds were found on her hands and forearms, suggesting she had fought back. But there were no signs that she had stood a chance. The level of violence was sudden and brutal, indicating not a planned attack but a rapid escalation, possibly a drunken outburst that spiraled into something irreversible. In Jacob's room, officers found empty liquor bottles, a cracked cell phone, and a torn photograph of him and Margaret from years before. His bed was unmade, the room reeking of sweat and stale beer. A worn notebook under the mattress held scribbled entries, angry, disjointed thoughts that hinted at resentment and guilt. One line stood out. "She never listens. I'm drowning. I can't keep this up." The evidence began forming a clear narrative. A troubled son, long overwhelmed by addiction and mental strain, had finally snapped in a drunken rage. Margaret's unwavering care and attempts to help had collided with Jacob's unraveling mental state. It wasn't just a case of murder. It was a slow-moving tragedy, unfolding behind closed doors while the rest of the town carried on unaware. The scene was not only heartbreaking, but emblematic of deeper issues: untreated addiction, emotional instability, and the hidden battles fought in silence. Jacob Ellis remained in custody as investigators and prosecutors worked to piece together the events that led to Margaret's violent death. The official toxicology report showed Jacob's blood alcohol level was over 3 times the legal limit. He had also ingested a mix of prescription medications, anti-anxiety pills prescribed to his mother, which when combined with alcohol could cause blackouts, aggression, and distorted perception. This raised the question, was Jacob even aware of what he was doing when the attack happened? The prosecution's case focused on establishing a pattern. Jacob hadn't just been drinking that day, he had been on a downward spiral for months. Bar tabs, witness statements, and security footage confirmed Jacob had been at a local dive bar just hours before the murder. He was reportedly agitated, pacing and slurring his words, and had gotten into an argument with a stranger over a pool game. Staff remembered him storming out, muttering to himself, around 9 p.m., about an hour before police believed Margaret was killed. Inside the Ellis home, the forensic team uncovered a bloodied fireplace poker tucked behind the living room curtains. The weapon matched the injuries on Margaret's skull. There were no signs of premeditation, no gloves, no effort to clean up the scene, and no attempt to flee. It seemed like a moment of blind, alcohol-fueled rage, but the randomness made it no less horrific. More alarming was what detectives discovered on Jacob's phone once it was recovered and unlocked. Though the screen was cracked, the data was intact. Recent voice memos revealed disturbing rants, Jacob talking to himself about his failures, blaming his mother for never understanding him, and referencing an invisible pressure that was building inside. These recordings weren't direct threats, but they illustrated a man unraveling under the weight of guilt, substance abuse, and possible undiagnosed mental illness. What disturbed investigators most wasn't the violence. It was how long this tension had been boiling beneath the surface without anyone stepping in. Friends of Jacob, when contacted, admitted they had stopped calling him months ago. He had become unpredictable, often lashing out or disappearing for days. Margaret, however, never gave up on him. Even in her personal journal, found in her bedside drawer, she wrote about her hopes for his recovery, praying that one day Jacob will find peace and purpose again. The court ordered a psychological evaluation. Jacob showed signs of depressive disorder, emotional instability, and substance-induced psychosis. According to the experts, he had likely blacked out during the attack, acting without full awareness of his actions. That didn't absolve him of responsibility, but it introduced legal complications. Prosecutors would need to weigh intent against impairment. As media interest in the case grew, public opinion divided. Some saw Jacob as a monster who deserved maximum punishment. Others viewed him as a symbol of failed systems, mental health, addiction treatment, and social support, all of which had failed to intervene before tragedy struck. The quiet, peaceful community of Maplewood now had a dark stain on its name, and no one could quite agree on who or what was truly to blame. Jacob Ellis sat alone in his holding cell, staring blankly at the concrete wall as investigators continued to peel back the layers of the night his mother died. While he claimed to have no memory of the incident, detectives were determined to reconstruct the timeline with clarity. Surveillance footage from a nearby liquor store placed Jacob there around 8:15 p.m., visibly intoxicated, stumbling as he bought a large bottle of vodka. It was just one of many purchases that week, showing a steady decline in his behavior. The store clerk later told police that Jacob seemed upset and agitated, muttering under his breath and slamming change on the counter. By 9 p.m., witnesses saw him walking unsteadily through the neighborhood. A neighbor recalled hearing the front door of the Ellis home slam shut, followed by a loud crash inside. No one called the police. It was just another disturbance, one of many in recent months, and people had grown used to the occasional noise coming from the house. But inside, something far more sinister was happening. Jacob, heavily intoxicated and under the influence of anti-anxiety pills he had taken earlier, erupted into a sudden rage. What triggered it remained unclear. Maybe it was a comment Margaret made, or perhaps it was something as small as a broken plate or a forgotten conversation. Regardless, the violence came swiftly. The living room bore the marks of chaos. A toppled coffee table, shattered glass, overturned furniture, and dark smears across the floor told the story of a struggle. The bloodied fireplace poker found hidden behind the curtains was identified as the weapon. Forensics showed it had been used repeatedly, with injuries indicating that Margaret tried to shield herself. Her hands bruised and fractured from attempting to block the blows. There were no defensive wounds on Jacob, no injuries suggesting he had been attacked first. In the days following his arrest, more disturbing evidence emerged. Text messages from Jacob's phone painted a picture of a man unraveling. He had sent erratic, angry messages to a former friend weeks earlier, ranting about feeling trapped, unworthy, and hopeless. A voicemail recovered from Margaret S. phone just hours before her death had her voice shaking as she left a message for her sister, saying she was worried Jacob was losing control. She didn't sound angry, only tired and scared. Detectives also found a half-written note in Jacob's bedroom, possibly a journal entry or an unsent letter. It contained dark thoughts about his own failures, a deep resentment toward his situation, and a final line that stood out. "I am sorry for what I'll become." That line, simple and haunting, seemed to foreshadow the very outcome investigators were trying to understand. Jacob's mental state, deteriorating over time and left unchecked, now stood at the center of the case. The evidence told a story of escalating tension, missed warning signs, and a final, irreversible act of violence. It was a tragedy rooted not just in a single night, but in the slow erosion of a man's identity and a mother's hope that she could save him before it was too late. The courtroom was packed on the first day of Jacob Ellis's trial. Reporters lined the back, townspeople filled the benches, and a photograph of Margaret Ellis rested on an easel near the prosecution table, reminding everyone of the woman at the heart of the tragedy. Jacob sat expressionless beside his defense attorney, his face thinner, paler than it had been at the time of his arrest. He had been sober for nearly 6 months, thanks to mandatory detox in custody, but he looked hollowed out, consumed by what he had done and the consequences still to come. The prosecution opened with a powerful narrative. They painted Jacob as a volatile man who had long depended on his mother for everything, from a roof over his head to emotional support, and who responded to her love with anger and violence. They showed the jury photographs of the crime scene, highlighted the blunt force injuries to Margaret's head, and walked through a timeline that led from Jacob's final visit to the bar to his drunken return home. Their goal was clear: to prove Jacob acted with reckless disregard for human life, even if he had no memory of the act itself. The defense, however, took a different approach. They didn't deny Jacob's role in Margaret's death. Instead, they argued that his actions were the result of an impaired mind, not malicious intent. They brought in psychologists who testified that Jacob was in a blackout state, an extreme level of intoxication where a person can function and even speak without forming lasting memories. Expert witnesses explained that such blackouts are more likely in people with chronic alcohol abuse and can lead to dissociative behavior, including sudden violence. It was not a defense of innocence, but of diminished capacity. Then came the twist that changed the mood in the courtroom. The defense presented a piece of evidence the prosecution had overlooked: a voicemail left by Margaret the night before her death. In it, she spoke with warmth and concern about Jacob's worsening mental health, pleading with a relative to convince him to get professional help. She admitted she was afraid he might hurt himself. This recording didn't excuse what happened, but it gave the jury context. Margaret had been aware of Jacob's struggles. She had tried, even in her final hours, to find a way to save him. As testimony continued, the emotional weight of the case grew heavier. A former teacher of Jacob's described him as a bright but troubled student, prone to mood swings but deeply sensitive. A childhood friend recalled Jacob's sudden isolation after his father's death years earlier and how he changed after that loss. Piece by piece, a more complete picture of Jacob emerged. Not a monster, but a broken man who had never received the help he needed. Still, the facts remained. A woman was dead. Her life had ended violently, at the hands of the very person she had dedicated herself to saving. No explanation could undo that truth. The jury would have to decide whether Jacob Ellis should be punished as a cold-blooded killer or as a man who had lost control in a moment of madness brought on by years of pain, addiction, and neglect. The jury deliberated for nearly 2 full days. Emotions ran high both inside and outside the courtroom, with some demanding the maximum penalty while others called for leniency, citing Jacob's mental health and addiction struggles. The trial had exposed deep cracks, not only within one family but in the systems meant to protect people like Jacob and Margaret. When the verdict was finally read aloud, the courtroom fell into a tense silence. Jacob Ellis was found guilty of voluntary manslaughter, not second-degree murder. The distinction meant the jury believed he had not planned to kill his mother, but that his reckless actions had directly led to her death. The sentence handed down was 15 years in prison, with mandatory enrollment in a long-term rehabilitation program and ongoing psychological treatment. For many in Maplewood, the outcome brought a strange sense of closure, though not necessarily justice. The image of a son killing his own mother had left an open wound in the town's collective memory. Some believed the sentence was too light for the brutality of the crime, while others saw it as a necessary acknowledgement of a far more complicated truth. In the weeks following the verdict, Margaret's funeral was held at the local community church. Despite the circumstances of her death, the turnout was large, and her legacy was honored with kindness. Friends remembered her tireless volunteer work, her devotion to helping others, and her quiet strength in caring for Jacob through his darkest moments. Her death had not just taken away a life. It had ended a long chapter of silent sacrifice, one many had never fully recognized until it was too late. Jacob, now sober for the first time in years, was transferred to a state facility where he would serve his sentence. Staff reported that he was compliant, withdrawn, and seemed haunted by what had happened. He rarely spoke during his first few weeks behind bars, spending most of his time reading or journaling. Through court-appointed counselors, he expressed guilt and grief, saying he didn't remember the night but understood he was responsible. He never once tried to deny it. In his own words, he had already received a life sentence inside his own mind. Margaret S. relatives took steps to create a local foundation in her name, one focused on addiction awareness and mental health education. They hoped that through her story, others might be spared similar tragedies. The foundation worked with local schools and hospitals, raising awareness of warning signs, promoting early intervention, and offering support to families dealing with loved ones in crisis. The house on Pine Avenue remained empty for months. Grass grew tall, windows gathered dust, and neighbors avoided walking past. Eventually, the property was sold quietly, the new owners unaware of the pain that once lived behind its walls. But for those who knew the truth, the story of Margaret and Jacob Ellis would never be forgotten. It was a reminder that even in the quietest homes, darkness can grow unnoticed, and that sometimes love alone isn't enough to save someone from themselves.